this video, I'm going to be assembling an awesome 1440p gaming PC build inside of this Corsair's brand new 3500. An interesting looking fish tank style PC case that starts at just $89. An unusually low price for Corsair. So what gives? Well, in this video, we're hopefully going to find out as we see whether all of these parts are really the best bet for a 1440p PC build right now. Let's do this. Now, I want to kick things off by addressing the elephant in the room, and I don't mean the PC case, instead I mean the CPU, because choosing what processor to opt for in this build is actually quite tricky. Now, for lots of well-documented reasons, Intel is, well, it's not going to work. 14th gen doesn't really make sense for more of these mid-range gaming PC builds anyway, and compound latest issues with voltages and instability, it's obviously not the route you're going to want to go. On the AMD side, things are again ever more complicated. Typically, I'd recommend the Ryzen 5 7600X or Ryzen 7 7700X, depending on whether you need more or less cores, aka whether you just want a game or whether you want to do some productivity applications too. But AMD's recent Ryzen 9000 launch sort of throws a bit of a complication at the build today. Like whenever AMD seem to release a new product, it's too expensive. Simply put, the Ryzen 5 7600X is under $200, while the new Ryzen 5 9600X is closer to $300. Now that's pretty eye-watering. Move up the spectrum somewhat to the Ryzen 7 9700X and things get even more complicated. Again, a price bump on this chip makes it hard to recommend, and while we think pricing will fall, we'll ultimately have to wait and see. To complicate matters even further, all of our own testing is having to be done after the launch, as like the last few CPU releases, AMD didn't send us any processors or any press materials, which kind of makes our recommendation decision slightly hard. So for the purposes of this build, I'm actually going to recommend the Ryzen 7 7700X. You get more cores than the last gen Ryzen 5 and the new Ryzen 5 for that matter, and a far cheaper price than the new 9700X. The very, very short answer to this very long and complicated conundrum is that for gaming, it doesn't really matter. Just buy whatever is cheaper. Decent clock speeds are going to be more than enough for 1440p, where let's face it, the GPU is more likely to be a bottleneck. Anyway, talking of which, that's a more simple conundrum. Kind of. This is the 4070 Super. I'm losing my mind today. Now, this is the Gigabyte AERO card, which looks very nice. You can see here, it's white and silver and rather fantastic. This is going to be great for 1440p in all the latest titles. Really love the 4070 Super. It's got 12 gigabytes of VRAM, class-leading DLSS 3, which is better than AMD FSR equivalent, and the ray tracing's better too. However, for the price, I feel like this build is full of howevers today. For the price, you may also want to consider the AMD RX 7800 XT and I guess the 7900 GRE, cards that are going to provide worse DLSS and worse ray tracing, but more rasterization and a bit more VRAM. Yes, the extra VRAM is really useful, but again, in our testing, it's something that's not really leveraged. It's kind of like going for a Ryzen 7 chip in a 1440p build. It's whether or not you need the extra functionality that memory offers. And again, for gaming alone, you probably don't. Now, to keep the CPU cool is another interesting component, and I'm hoping this one's going to be slightly more simple to discuss. This is the new Corsair iCUE Link Titan 360 RX. Now, this is Corsair's new range of coolers that is going to be a little bit cheaper than their current top-end iCUE Link H150i as the direct competitor. This is more slimmed down, but actually includes, I think for the first time, their own block and their own pump design. Now, what I like is that the radiator and fans come pre-mounted, very nice. And a little trick with these Corsair fans is that if you don't like the Corsair text here, which I'm personally not a massive fan of, you can just pull these covers off. And what that's also going to do is improve the RGB lighting in the system due to the fact there's less diffusion and you're actually going to see the RGB more clearly. These are Corsair's RX fans, so they're actually cheaper than the QX fans you would have typically seen on iCUE Link. They look a bit more basic, but actually they're slightly better when it comes to air pressure and used for things like radiators. Of course, we have the block design. That's actually very, very nice. This is Corsair's own in-house option, and I think that this should spin. So depending on the orientation, yeah, lovely and magnetic. You can have it whatever way you want. You can change out the top plate of the pump with extra optional designs too, from one which focuses on RGB to another that has VRM cooling via a dedicated fan on top of the CPU water block. You can find our full review of this cooler on our website where it's stacked up well, and despite being fairly pricey, impressed us in its testing. I'll link that in the description below and in the cards section now. Moving through to some more known quantities and not brand new components, RAM and SSD. Now, I've obviously gone for 32 gigs of RAM. This is the Corsair Vengeance RGB in white. This one is one of the earlier DDR5 DDR5 kits, while the latency is okay, it only clocks in at 5600. I'd recommend going for 6000 or higher, especially now DDR5 prices have fallen. And I'll link this alongside everything below and different options, alternatives at the affiliate links in the description. Storage-wise, I've gone for the Teamgroup MP44L. This is a little bit of a dark horse, a quiet contender in the SSD market, and in our testing has delivered really, really strong performance. Yes, technically we could recommend a higher end, more flashy drive, and it wouldn't look out of place in this build, but the MP44L has everything we need, and I'll be installing that in a few moments. As far as where I'll be installing all of these components, that's where this comes in. And again, I didn't mean for this build to be complicated or different. This is actually really interesting. You may have heard of Asus BTF and MSI Project Zero, which are their back-to-front motherboard designs. But did you know Gigabyte were actually more of a pioneer in this bit of the market than anyone else? And that's right, Gigabyte's Project Stealth was actually with us a number of years ago as a bit of a pilot scheme, and then I think Gigabyte sort of thought nobody was really that bothered and sort of stopped. And now they're back, and this is, well, it's absolutely stunning. What they've done, like all the other boards you might have seen, is moved all the connectors to the rear, and corresponding cutouts on the 3500 mean this board should just slot in with no problems, and all the connectors can be plugged in from the back. Now this makes cable management easier, it makes the build tidier, and makes the whole thing look a bit more sleek. What Gigabyte have done though, which I really like, is this. Now they've kind of made the bottom of the motherboard feel like it's not there, and that's because it's all hidden under this toollessly removable, I'm going to say heatsink, heat spreader, one big metal plate, and under there you'll find all the M.2 slots. You can see here 2 toolless NVMEs, like to see that. There's not really anything else. The motherboard battery and a standoff screw, so you'll need to take this out for the standoff screw, and it looks like the contact pin here is going to mean we have a bit of RGB on this plate. You'll also see 2 blue thermal pads. You can actually go ahead and peel these off if you're installing an NVMe, and that's what's going to provide the link between that and this heat spreader, which will help to keep them cool. The only trade-off really to note, and it is quite a big one, is that there are then no extra PCI slots. So you can't add in another GPU, not that anybody does that anymore, but if you wanted to add in a network card for whatever reason, you can't do that. So let me remove all of our peels, of which there are really very many, before going ahead and installing a number of the components. And having done so has also shown me that there are lots of extra removable bits on this motherboard. These presumably are to hide things like standoff screw hole locations, and I actually really admire this from Gigabyte. The only thing they're missing is the ability to plug the GPU directly in from a power point of view. That's something only Asus seem to have at the moment. It has its pros, it has its cons, but it does mean we are going to need at least one visible cable in this build. First things first, it's time to install whichever Ryzen CPU you've selected. It feels weird to recommend the last gen product almost, but I'm not necessarily sure I would call Ryzen 9000 a truly generational upgrade over the 7000 option. So for this build, Ryzen 7000 it is, but I'll link everything down below as usual. Once the CPU's in, the RAM and the SSD are next, I'm going to go ahead and start with the memory. This is going to go in the 2nd and 4th slots by pulling back the aptly color coordinated white clips on the end of the DIMMs and sliding these into place. The SSD is next, and this is fully toolless. Really like to see what Gigabyte have done here. I'm going to use the top slot as I don't anticipate upgrading this build, but if you are in future, maybe use the ones below, as the top slot is Gen 5 and has the bigger cooling solution on to match. Either way, looks good, and I love the fact that Gigabyte have done a great job making this toolless. Good work, guys. Once all that's done, I'm going to venture into the bag of included AMD mounting hardware and locate the 2 AMD brackets required for this build. By the looks of things, it's going to leverage the included backplate, which means all that I need to do is take out each of these white plastic brackets on the bottom and the top of the processor. Keep these in your motherboard box in case you ever decide to sell the motherboard or need to RMA it as one example. With all of that sorted, the case is the next thing to take a look at, and this is where I'm actually quite intrigued to see what it is Corsair have done with the 3500. Now, I have seen this case in person before at Computex 2024, and I thought at the time it looked pretty good. Now, I'm not gonna lie, it's not massively different to lots of the other fish tank style PC cases on the market. And my first impressions are that it's kind of giving me Fantech's MV5 vibes, which is most certainly a good thing. Now, the range starts at $89. This one is $20 more, given the inclusion of 3 ARGB fans. And this is where things start to get a little bit weird. Now, for a long time, one of Corsair's biggest selling points was Corsair iCUE. And amongst a myriad of pretty terrible RGB software ecosystems, I really like it. However, this doesn't use Corsair's own proprietary connectors. Instead, it uses these 3-pin ARGB cables, the same as what you'll find you'll plug into the motherboard. Now, on one hand, this is great because it means it's much more open, you can can plug into existing hardware, sync the lighting up, and you haven't got to rely on Corsair's proprietary options. But on the other hand, it means you've got less control over things like the LEDs on the fan. They're less assignable because this is traditional daisy chaining versus the cooler, which uses a digital daisy chain where you can individually say, well, I want this bit of the fan to be blue and this bit to be red. You can't do that when it comes to a standard daisy chain system. And I wanted to be positive about this case because I like the design, I like the actual form of the case. This just looks a bit I was expecting this to be cable managed much better, potentially even to have like holes that you can run the cables through at the back. And I have to say, there's no grommets either. Room for a fan down the bottom, room for a fan at the rear. I think for $20 Corsair, considering these are just basic 4-pin PWM and ARGB fans, you could have put another one at the rear. I do like the perforations design though. I like the glass panels. The real test is if I take the front one off, how much flex is in the case? Not very much. The build quality actually feels better than the 6500 range, which has had a bit of heat in recent months and weeks, given the fact that the panels on it are quite thin. This seems to address the problem, and overall, I do like it. I promise this video is going to be positive and going to be like exciting. This build should look sick at the end. Good thing, I see James has found something he likes. The good thing is these cables are all fully sleeved in white, which is a really nice piece of attention to detail. Even the actual end pieces here, the plastic moldings that are going to connect to the motherboard, are white. And let's face it, you can always sort cables out. We can always cable manage and hide them away. There are problems that can be fixed, and the cable management is certainly one of them with a bit of time and attention. The next step is to install the motherboard. Now, this is an ATX board, ATX case, silver standoffs. I like it. It means everything is in the right place. And all you've got to do is grab the motherboard, be careful of the connections on the back, and slide it into place. Inside the included accessory box, I'm hoping I'm going to find some screws. It's going to be these screws in the middle as far as the motherboard installation is concerned. In order to install the screws on the motherboard, you will need to remove a lot of the covers and paneling. This is what's actually going to expose those motherboard installation screws. This top panel as well also comes off, as does this panel down the bottom of the case here. Again, that's going to expose a number of screws that I'm going to use to secure the motherboard in. 3 screws at the top, 3 screws along the middle, and 3 screws along the bottom. The next port of call is the cooler, and I have to say, the whole build's looking pretty good so far. Now, this 360mm unit is going to make the most sense at the top of the PC build. Now, where Corsair's case lets them down on the cable management front, the cooler doesn't. Being all iCUE link makes it super easy to cable manage, and I am actually going to go ahead and run the connection into the side of this fan, which will be tucked away at the rear, meaning you will not see it. I believe the water block, that's got a USB-C and an iCUE link connector on the side, meaning those are just going to run up and away from the motherboard. Simple case of removing the top panel, lining the radiator up at the top, and securing it with the included silver screws and washers that come with the cooler. Once this is done, I'll replace the brackets on the water block, and the pre-installed thermal paste makes the final remainder of the installation really easy. One less step to worry about, and the pre-installed fans are a nice touch too. The next component on my proverbial hit list is the GPU. Now, really a big fan of the AERO range from Gigabyte. I think it actually does a really good job of creating a white color scheme GPU that looks classy, that looks expensive, and isn't, generally speaking, their most expensive offering. So all in all, a really solid shout. Other good white options include Zotac have got one, which I quite like for the whole of the 40 series. Asus have got their Tough design, which is now offered in white, and Strix, but Strix is very expensive in white. This is a more reasonable offering, in my opinion. Now then, in terms of which PCI lanes they're removing, it's going to be the second and third PCI slots. So this one just here first of all, and then the one below it as well. And with that, the graphics card is just going to slide into place. Nice and simple. Get it lined up. Push the little latch back as well. There we go. Yeah, look at that. Oh, that looks amazing. Yes. Couple of those screws back in to secure it into place. Graphics card matches perfectly. Even the white is the good shade for the case, and all that remains is the power supply. Now, the Corsair RM850X Shift. Now, I said to Corsair when they very kindly sent this case out for review and for this video, what white power supplies have you got? And this is one of the only options right now. I'm hoping they do a white RM750E because that's more reasonable, and for a build like this would probably be better value. I really like their Shift series. That's where where all of the connectors are moved to the side, it makes them much easier to access. And these are the smaller, I was going to say Type 4, but it says Corsair Type 5 cable sets. And of course, this is a, yes, silent operation. So the fan's only going to spin up when it's absolutely needed. And it's nice to see it color matched to the build. It technically doesn't really matter in some of the BTF builds whether or not it's color matched, unless you of course have a GPU with the power cable at the front. For that, you're going to need a PCI Generation 5 power cable in white. Give me a few moments to get the power supply screwed in, all the cables connected up. I'm going to do the power cables first, CPU, followed by motherboard, which is the largest, and of course GPU, and then all of the front panel cables. And I'm also going to need just a few moments to get the front panel cables hopefully a bit more tidy before booting this thing up. Into performance, and it's time to see how this build stacks up. Now, it does perform well, and I was impressed in our testing with Nvidia's 4070 Super. I should point out you can build a higher spec system for the same price as this build, and where extra money's been spent on the CPU cooler and motherboard, you could trim back costs for sure. I also think that going for an iCUE Link cooler and not an iCUE Link case might have been a mistake. They sync fairly well in Signal RGB once you get stuff moving. There's a great bit of software that I'll link below, but I do think that Corsair are confusing the landscape a little bit by having iCUE devices and then ones that plainly just aren't compatible with their own software. It's all quite a lot to comprehend. Now, in terms of performance, tested a range of games on this build, starting off with Alan Wake 2. Now, at 1440p high settings with DLSS enabled and set to quality, the build really does well. 94 FPS on average was very impressive, and Alan Wake 2 is one of those games where the inclusion of DLSS, especially when you want to play with ray tracing, is really important. Call of Duty's Warzone was again a good story, as it often is in our builds. 1440p high, DLSS set to quality. This is going to have a little bit of an impact on the actual resolution and visual fidelity, but increase frame rate and reduce latency. And here this system achieved 190 FPS on average. Starfield at 1440p high again performed pretty well, 91 frames per second on average. Not the highest frame rate in the world, but for an RPG where you spend lots of time in the loading menus, I think this is more than sufficient. Hogwarts Legacy at 1440 high is next up, and here the frame rate comes in at 140 FPS, quite similar to the 1440 resolution. Again, for an RPG game, this is more than enough, and I thought the title looked great. Moving through into Fortnite at 1080p competitive settings, where high frame rates are super important, and the build again did well, 260 FPS on average, while Apex Legends rounds up the benchmarking for this system. 1440p high again, as with pretty much all the titles today, and the build achieved just shy of 250 FPS, with 244 frames to be precise. A bit of a difficult build, this one, from a case that I haven't used before, to a CPU choice dilemma that I think lots of us are going to be facing over the coming months, and some components which really pose headaches when it comes to part selection. What do you think? Do you think I got it right? Got this build wrong? Let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this one and you aren't already, make sure to get subscribed, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.